Chapter 10. Srinivas had nowadays little time to bother about the outside world, being fully engaged on the revived banner. It now emerged from an office in Market Road itself, coming off the Empire Press, which, though small in itself, seemed to Srinivas a vast organization. It had at least half a dozen type boards.
A twin-cylinder machine turned off the formies, and one did not have to wait for 4 pages to be printed to get the types ready for the next 4. In contrast with the truth printing works, this appeared to be a revolutionary step forward. A small room was partitioned off with a red movable screen, and that separated the printer from the editor.
The printer was a taciturn, dull man, who took no interest in the matter he printed, who would show no accommodation in financial matters, but who was thoroughly punctual and precise in doing his work. Srinivas found himself facing, for the first time, financial problems as a reality. He couldn't restart the banner without paying in advance and buying the paper for it.
There was no longer Sampath between him and financial shocks. He spent long worrying hours speculating how he should manage it. He solved the problem by writing a letter to his brother, asking for the amount out of his share in the ancestral property.
He hated himself for writing this, but it was the only way out. He avoided deliberately any highfalutin references to his work, any abstract principles involved in it, but tried to appear sordid. He wrote, "You know the old fable of a man who mounted a tiger. I'm in the same position.
The banner has to be kept fluttering in the air if I'm to survive. I may tell you that it has built itself up nicely, and there is not much groundwork to be done for it now. I've still all the old subscribers' rolls, and I'm also taking in a few pages of advertisements, and so don't you worry at all about its finances.
But I require some temporary accommodation. If you can lend me a couple of thousands or, if it is impossible, give me 2,000 out of my share in our property, I shall be grateful for the timely help." His brother accepted it as a legitimate demand and sent him the amount with only the admonition, "Please be a little more practical-minded in the management of your affairs.
I would strongly advise you to have an accountant to look after your accounts and tell you from time to time how you stand. Don't grudge this expense." He added a note of warning, "You will understand that ancestral property is after all a sacred trust, and not loose money meant for the fanciful expenditure of the individual. It really belongs to our children and their children."
Children and their children, it produced a lovely picture on the mind like the vista of an endless colonnade. But the first part of the sentence made him indignant. "He blesses with his hand, and kicks with his feet," he moaned.
"Shall I send back this amount?" His wife advised him, "He has merely said that you must be careful with the money. Why should that make you angry?"
Srinivas cooled down and said, "All right then, I will take it now, but return it at the earliest possible moment." He wrote to his brother to this effect, while acknowledging the amount, and it had the unexpected result of bringing from him a warm letter appreciating the resolution and repeating the advice to provide himself with an accountant. He accepted the reasonableness of this suggestion and acted upon it immediately.
The Empire Press man lent him his own accountant for a couple of hours each day, for a small consideration. Srinivas turned his back on Kabir Lane without a sigh. He rummaged his garret, filled a couple of baskets with all the papers there, and descended the steps for the last time.
The building was now held on lease by Sunrise Pictures, and no life stirred there. The door of the registered offices and of the director of productions remained locked up. He felt he could no longer stand a meeting with Somu, Sohan Lal or De Mello.
They seemed to him figures out of a nightmare. He merely sent the key to the studio with a messenger. Out of all the welter of paper he was carrying away, he took care not to miss the little sketch of Ravi's in the cardboard file.
Asterisk. Asterisk. Nonsense, an adult occupation, was one of the outstanding editorials he wrote after the banner's rebirth.
He analyzed and wrote down much of his studio experience in it. Adulthood was just a mask that people wore, the mask made up of a thick jowl and double chin and diamond earrings, or a green sporting shirt. But within it a man kept up the nonsense of his infancy, worse now for being without the innocence and the pure joy.
Only the values of commerce gave this state a gloss of importance and urgency. This brought Somu into his office one day. His fingers sparkled with diamonds as he clutched his cane.
Srinivas sent up a silent prayer at the sight of him. "Oh, God, save me from these people and give me the strength to face them now." Somu's incapacity to speak out was once again evident.
He sat clearing his throat and trying to smile. Srinivas forbore to ask him about the studio or their picture. Oh, God, don't involve me again with these people, he prayed.
Somu asked, how is it, you don't come near the studio? Srinivas felt it was unnecessary to give any answer. Somu persisted, and Srinivas merely said, I have no business there.
Ah, how can you say so?
How can we run a studio without the help of story writers like you, sir? Srinivas had no answer to give. He felt a deep hurt within him, seeing those fat cheeks and diamonds and the memory of Ravi in the cell, mumbling incoherently. He felt like crying out, you are all people who try to murder souls.
Somu said, your journal. We see you have said something about us. This seemed to be interesting.
Srinivas asked, what exactly have I said? Somu tapped the table nervously and said, I didn't read it fully. How much of it really did you read then?
In fact, I meant to read it later, but DeMello took it away and told me about it. He said that there was something about the studio, said Somu. In that case you may read it now, said Srinivas, taking out a copy of the issue and handing it to him.
Somu looked at it for a few moments, turned its pages curiously, and rolled it up. Why are you folding it up? Asked Srinivas. I will read it at home, replied Somu apologetically.
No. I want you to read it at once, said Srinivas. A look of panic came into Somu's eyes.
All of it? He asked, looking at the rolled up copy in his hand. Yes, it is only 12 pages. Oh, sir, please excuse me, begged Somu.
Srinivas became adamant. He enjoyed very much bullying Somu. It seemed to him that he was getting a bit of his own back after all.
He wanted to cry, how should I have felt when you fellows worried me to death and had everything your own way? He enjoyed Somu's discomfiture, and again insisted upon his going through the journal on the spot. He wondered why Somu did not brush him aside and ask him to mind his business.
But he didn't. He meekly said, I came only to spend a few minutes with you and find out about the article. Yes, but how can you talk about it unless you read it?
Go on, at least read the article you wish to discuss. Somu looked at him appealingly for a moment, took out his glasses and poised them over his nose, spread out the issue and tilted it towards the window light. Looking at him thus, Srinivas felt that this must be counted as a major conquest in his career.
He attended to the papers on his table, and a clearing of the throat from the other drew his attention. He looked up and saw Somu anxiously looking at him, wondering if he would be permitted to put down the paper now. He started taking off his glasses when Srinivas looked at him fixedly and said, Yes? I've finished reading it.
Srinivas wondered for a moment whether he could command him to go through the next article, but he refrained. It might prove to be the last straw. Somu might, after all, assert his independence and refuse. Srinivas felt, seeing the agonized face of the other as he was put through this trial, that all his wrongs of recent months were sufficiently avenged, and he felt his humanity returning. He became almost tender as he asked, Well, sir, what about it now?
DeMello said there was something about our production in it, said Somu. That's why I came here. Now you find nothing in it? Asked Srinivas.
Nothing about our production. I don't know what made DeMello say so. He appeared indignant at the trick played upon him.
Srinivas said quietly, DeMello is right. If you take the copy home and read it carefully, you will understand, and then you can come and talk it over with me. He looked puzzled.
Why should you attack our film, sir? He asked angrily. After all, you wrote the story.
It is not right, sir, that you should be unkind to us. He clutched his walking stick and got up to go. Srinivas said, You must read the paper regularly if you are to understand my point of view.
It is not unkindness. Why don't you take out a subscription for a year? It is only 10 rupees.
I have no time to read, sir, that is the trouble. Just as you find the time to eat and sleep, you must find the time to read a paper like the Banner. It's meant for people like you.
Somu took out 10 rupees and placed it on the table. Srinivas wrote out a receipt and gave it him. Somu folded it and put it in his purse and started to go, but said, stopping halfway, After all, we spend lakhs of rupees on our pictures, and you must be careful not to prejudice the public against us and damage us.
Srinivas kept Ravi in his own home. He had more or less the task of running both the households on his own means. Ravi's little sister came in several times a day with a petition for a rupee or two, and Srinivas ungrudgingly parted with them and advised his wife to do so in his absence.
Ravi's father had given up talking not only to Ravi but also to Srinivas. He let out a sort of growl whenever he sensed Srinivas passing in front of his house. He was reported, by Srinivas's wife, to be continually saying, "He ruined my son by putting notions into his head.
Now he wants to ruin the rest of the family." This naturally roused her indignation, and she asked, "Why should we ever bother about these people when they are so ungrateful?" Srinivas merely told her, "Don't waste your energy listening to what he or anybody says.
Just give them any help you can." "For how long?" she asked. Srinivas scratched his head.
There seemed to be really no means of saying how long. "And what are you going to do about him?" she asked, indicating the corner of the hall where Ravi sat mumbling his chant.
Srinivas kept him with him because he had a feeling that Ravi's own home might hinder rather than help a possible recovery. He fed him, looked after his personal needs and kept him there. He must be protected from his family, he explained.
All this discussion had to be carried on in subdued voices in the kitchen while dining, since the front half of their house was occupied by one or the other of Ravi's relations. His little brothers and sisters came round and sat there in front of him. Sometimes they laughed at him and sometimes they ran away in fear.
Unremittingly he kept repeating his sentences, though no one could follow anything that he was saying. Often his mother came up and sat in front of him, coaxed him to eat this or that, some special preparation that she made at home with her meager resources. Srinivas's wife, after her initial protests, was often moved by this spectacle and sat down with her and tried to comfort her.
The old lady was beginning to think that the matter with Ravi was that he was possessed. She recounted a dozen instances similar to his, where exorcising restored a man to his normal state. So one evening, returning home from his office, Srinivas found strange activities going on.
Ravi had become the center of the picture. In front of him were set out trays of saffron and flowers, huge twigs of magosa leaves, and a camphor flare. A wild-looking man with huge beads around his neck, clad in red silk, his forehead dabbed with vermilion, officiated at the ceremony.
He looked very much like Shiva in makeup. The air choked with incense burning in a holder. He had a couple of assistants sitting behind him, one bearing a cymbal and the other a little rattling drum which produced a peculiarly shrill noise.
The chief man had a thin cane of a whip-like thinness at his feet, and he had smeared it with saffron and vermilion. Ravi's mother sat near this group with a reverent look in her eyes, and Srinivas saw his own wife running about, ministering to their wants ungrudgingly. Little Ramu and the other youngsters of the neighboring house stood peeping in at the doorway.
They looked slightly scared and thought it safer to keep their distance so. Srinivas stood at the threshold, arrested by the scene. Ramu had wanted to bound towards him and tell him in advance, but he was unwilling to forfeit his place in the doorway, and so kept calling in a suppressed voice, "Father, father."
But before he could say anything more, Srinivas had come upon the scene. An exclamation of surprise escaped his lips. His wife came to him in great haste and drew him away into the kitchen.
She closed the middle door and cautioned him, "Don't say any inauspicious word now." "Whose idea is this?" he asked sourly.
"That lady has been wanting to do it. You must not say anything against it. Where can she go, poor lady?"
"Her husband might not allow it, or he might swear at them all the time." "Ah! You know now why I wanted Ravi to be kept here, do you understand?"
he said with mild glee. She accepted his triumph without a protest. Yes, with that old man there, how can they?"
And this pacified Srinivas. He realized at once that he had become mildly vengeful. The other day it was Somu on whom he had tried to take it out, and today his wife. "At this rate I fear I may do a lot of people to death in due course," he told himself.
He looked at his wife. He found her eyes dancing with interest. She was fully part of the affair and seemed to feel specially gratified at being the hostess of this exotic function.
He muttered under his breath, "The whole thing is too silly for words." He recollected the tribal worship done before the camera at the studio on the inauguration day. This is no worse.
At least this is more innocent and uncommercial, he reflected. His wife said, "It is also a good thing, you know. He knows all about the ghost that haunts this house that people talk about."
He says it has got into Ravi. He will drive it out, and we can live here with a free mind afterwards. Seeing that she had not made much of an impression, she asked, "Isn't it wonderful?"
He replied, "He probably got the story out of some gossip monger." "I don't know why you are so cynical," she said, and left him and went away to the front room. He followed her, feeling that he might as well watch the scene.
Ravi's mother looked up at him from time to time with grateful eyes. The magician was reciting something monotonously in a stentorian voice, and his pauses were punctuated rhythmically by the cymbals and the rattle drum. Her eyes were shut, and Ravi sat oblivious of his surroundings. A few margosa leaves were scattered on him.
The chants and rhythmic beats went on and produced a kind of hypnosis in everyone assembled there, and Srinivas saw Ravi gradually shaking his head and swaying. He found the atmosphere oppressive and unbearable, the gong and the drum beat, the pungent, piercing smell of the incense, its smoke hanging in the air, and the camphor flare illumination. Srinivas suddenly said to himself, "I might be in the 20th century BC for all it matters, or 4000 BC.
In that half-dim hall, a sweep of history passed in front of his eyes. His scenario-writing habit suddenly asserted itself. His little home, the hall and all the folk there, Anderson Lane and, in fact, Malgudi itself dimmed and dissolved on the screen.
There was a blankness for a while, and then there faded in an uninhabited country. The Mempi jungle extended everywhere. The present market road was an avenue of wild trees, a narrow footpath winding its way through the long grass. Presently appeared on this path Sri Rama, the hero of Ramayana.
He was a perfect man, this incarnation of Vishnu. Over his shoulder was slung his famous bow which none could even lift. He was followed by his devoted brother Laxman and Hanuman, the monkey god.
Rama was on his way to Lanka, Ceylon, to battle with evil there, in the shape of Ravana who abducted Sita. The enemy was a perfection of evil with all its apparent strength and invincibility. Rama had to redeem righteousness.
He was on his way to a holy war, which would wipe out wrong and establish on earth truth, beauty and goodness. He rested on a sandy stretch in a grove, and looked about for a little water for making a paste for his forehead marking. There was no water.
He pulled an arrow from his quiver and scratched a line on the sand, and water instantly appeared. Thus was born the river Sarayu. The river flowed on.
On its banks sprang up the thatched roofs of a hamlet, a pastoral community who grazed their cattle in the jungles and brought them back home before nightfall and securely shut themselves and their animals in from prowling tigers and jackals. The jungle, with its sky-touching trees, gradually receded further and further, and cornfields appeared in its place. The waving tufts of rice, standing to a man's height, swayed in the air and stretched away as far as the eye could see.
When the Buddha came this way, preaching his gospel of compassion, centuries later, he passed along the main street of a prosperous village. Men, women and children gathered around him. He saw a woman weeping.
She had recently lost her child and seemed disconsolate. He told her he would give her consolation if she could bring him a handful of mustard from any house where death was unknown. She went from door to door and turned away from every one of them.
Amongst all those hundreds of houses she could not find one where death was a stranger. She understood the lesson. A little crumbling masonry and a couple of stone pillars, beyond lowly extension, now marked the spot where the Buddha had held his congregation. The great Shankara appeared during the next millennium.
He saw on the river bank a cobra spreading its hood and shielding a spawning frog from the rigor of the midday sun. He remarked, "Here the extremes meet. The cobra, which is the natural enemy of the frog, gives it succor.
This is where I must build my temple." He installed the goddess there and preached his gospel of Vedanta, the identity and oneness of God and his creatures. And then the Christian missionary with his Bible.
In his wake the merchant and the soldier, people who paved the way for Edward Shilling and his Inglaterra Bank. Dynasties rose and fell. Palaces and mansions appeared and disappeared.
The entire country went down under the fire and sword of the invader, and was washed clean when Sarayu overflowed its bounds. But it always had its rebirth and growth. And throughout the centuries, Srinivas felt, this group was always there, Ravi with his madness, his well-wishers with their panaceas and their apparatus of cure.
Half the madness was his own doing, his lack of self-knowledge, his treachery to his own instincts as an artist, which had made him a battleground. Sooner or later he shook off his madness and realized his true identity, though not in one birth, at least in a series of them. What did it amount to?
Srinivas asked himself as the historical picture faded out. Who am I to bother about Ravi's madness or sanity? What madness to think I am his keeper?
This notion seemed to him so ridiculous that he let out a laugh. The others in the small room looked at him startled. His wife came near him and peered into his face anxiously and asked, "Why did you laugh?"
Did I? He asked. I recollected some joke, that's all.
Don't bother about me. Now they had stopped their recitations and drum beats. Ravi, with half-shut eyes, was swaying.
The exorcist picked up his cane and thwacked it sharply over Ravi's back and asked at the same time, "Now will you go or not?" Ravi smarted a little under the blow, and rolled his eyes, and the thwacking was renewed with vigor. The question was addressed to the evil spirit possessing him.
Ravi winced under the repeated blows. Srinivas felt an impulse to cry out, "Stop it! It is absurd and cruel."
But he found himself incapable of any effort. The recent vision had given him a view in which it seemed to him all the same whether they thwacked Ravi with a cane or whether they left him alone, whether he was mad or sane, all that seemed unimportant and not worth bothering about. The whole of eternity stretched ahead of one, there was plenty of time to shake off all follies.
Madness or sanity, suffering or happiness seemed all the same. It didn't make the slightest difference in the long run. In the rush of eternity nothing mattered. It was no more important or remembered than an attack of malaria in the lifetime of a centenarian. Whether one was mad or sane or right or wrong didn't make the slightest difference. It was like bothering about a leaf floating on a rushing torrent, whether it was floating on its right side or wrong side.
He got up abruptly and left the room. He went into the street and stood there uncertainly, looking up and down. There was a momentary haziness in his mind as to what period he was existing in, existence seeming so persistent and inescapable.
Later Ravi's mother came out to say, "Shall I take Ravi to the temple at Salem? It is a day's journey from here. The exorcist says that if Ravi is kept there at its portals for a week, he will be quite well."
There are hundreds of people living there. By all means, said Srinivas, and added with conviction, he is bound to get well again. Even madness passes.
Only existence asserts itself. Your wife has promised to look after Ravi's father's needs. It was with difficulty that he could repress the remark, "It's all the same whether he is looked after or not."
What if he perishes? What can we do? We have to trouble you.
He is so unreasonable and difficult to manage. We are sorry to put the burden on you, but for the sake of that boy, we don't mind the trouble in the least.
We will look after the old gentleman. Later Srinivas's wife told him, "I've given them 20 rupees of housekeeping money. You must replace the amount."
Poor folk. Of course. I will replace it and more.
Go ahead and do what you like. His wife felt baffled by his elated manner. Srinivas engaged a carriage to take Ravi and his mother to the railway station next evening.
The old lady had rolled up a couple of carpets and pillows and tied them with a hemp rope. She had stuffed a few items of clothing into a tin trunk. She had a basket in which she carried a pot of water and a few plantains.
The old gentleman was in an utter mental confusion. If he could have got up and moved about, he would have prevented the trip. He kept on shouting at them, "Why should she go?
With whose permission is she leaving the town and traveling? What brazenness has come over our women?" The old lady finished an early dinner.
The numerous children gathered around and pestered her for this and that, and all of them set up a howl, demanding to be taken along to the railway. She carried with them the two youngest. She had oiled and parted their hair, washed their faces, and thrust them into new clothes. They were bubbling over with joy.
The other children threw murderous looks at them and shouted imprecations. The old man shouted above it all, "Why should she go, leaving these children to cry? Is there no one to whom she will listen?"
He cried, "Mr. Editor, oh, Mr. Editor." He had spurned Srinivas all these days, but turned to him now out of desperation. He called so insistently that Srinivas could not help responding.
He went up to the doorway and stood there and asked, "What is it, sir?" "Oh, you are there. Come nearer."
"Come and sit down here. Take a seat, you are a learned man." "I'm quite comfortable here, what is it?"
Srinivas asked. Please tell her to stop. She is going away.
She is disobeying me. She will be back in 10 or 15 days, don't worry. You need not tell me that.
She must not go. She is not going for her pleasure. She is going.
Yes, I know. For that brigand Sake. Why should she go?
He is not our son. No man who has been in prison can be our son. Why should she trouble about him?
If she is my wife, let her give him up. What has she to do with him? Don't lose your head, sir.
Be calm. Who are you to tell me about my head? You have ruined that rascal son of mine by dragging him into your associations, and you are ruining my wife and family.
You are out to blight our family. Don't mind what he says, said the lady, wringing her hands in despair. But her face was bright with the anticipation of a journey.
Not at all, Srinivas said. He will get his food all right. Food.
I will fling it out, if anyone brings the food cooked in another's house, raved the old man. Srinivas looked at the lined face of Ravi's aged mother. How much must she have stood from him for 40 years, he reflected and admired her fortitude.
The Jutka arrived at the door. The lady picked up her baggage and the 2 children and went to her husband to bid him goodbye. The old man averted his face, put out his arms without a word, and touched the 2 children.
Tears rolled down his cheeks. Srinivas went over to Ravi's corner in his house and told him, "Come along, let us go to the station." Ravi looked up at him.
That was some improvement. After the thwacking, he was showing responses to stimuli. Srinivas helped him up and led him to the Jutka and assisted him in.
His mother and the children followed. She took an elaborate farewell of Srinivas's wife, who followed her down the street and, for inexplicable reasons, started crying when the Jutka began to move. Any farewell or parting will bring tears, I suppose, Srinivas reflected as he sat beside the driver and urged him to run fast enough to catch the 8.20 train towards Trichy.